appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. I thought it would probably be kind of worthwhile. I mean, obviously the scope of this is really to talk about last mile, but I thought it would kind of be worthwhile to talk a little bit about TMW in general. For most of you who know who TMW is, you kind of think of TMW as kind of the enterprise platform that manages really the order to cash process for transportation organizations. So really everything from getting your inbound orders on the EDI, rating, routing, optimization, tendering that to a carrier, dispatching it to your own fleet. You got to have the ability then to have visibility to where that is while in transit, be able to report on that from a metrics perspective, and then manage kind of that billing and settlement on the back end piece. So that's really kind of the core of what most of the people in this room probably see TMW. If you look at who the markets that we primarily serve, and really it falls into 3 or 4 categories. Obviously, the for-hire carriers is pretty much a lot of the people in this room fall into that bucket, as well as third-party logistics and brokerage. But we also have a significant presence in the private fleet market space. And really what we try to do is offer a set of tools that is adaptable across all of these spaces. And one of the reasons that we've kind of made that our mission is in the last several years, and as well as going forward, we really see a convergence in these markets. So we see the for-hire carriers that are operating in many ways. They're wanting to bring on and offer dedicated contract capacity for their existing customers. Same thing for brokers. They're looking at typically doing some things that maybe have a little bit of assets involved as well. And then you've got the 3PLs that they're acquiring assets to be able to guarantee service. And then finally the private fleets, which traditionally have focused more on transporting and delivering their own goods, are now getting into a situation where they're understanding the definition of a backhaul does not necessarily mean inbound product coming back into my distribution center that I'm going to send back out. I might want to be able to exercise some for-hire authority to be able to offset some of my costs. So putting that in perspective, I'm going to talk about really kind of what the last mile, the challenges of the last mile, the solutions available for the last mile, and really kind of from a logistics service provider's perspective, how can we utilize the tools that are available to be able to excel in the final mile. So from a TMW perspective, we actually offer final mile solutions in a couple of different ways. Ultimately, those solutions can be consumed both from inside one of our TMS applications, as well as delivered as kind of a standalone offering for private fleets. The thing about the standalone offering for private fleets is that the difference there being that they don't necessarily need all of the functions and features that a full TMS offers. So they're looking at, think of it as more of I need the routing and scheduling, but I also need more of a dispatch light type application that manages the dispatch, manages visibility, manages reporting, but not necessarily the full order to cash process, billing and settlement, and the things that a for-hire carrier might be interested in. So that's kind of the TMW overview. I apologize for that. We're going to go straight into the final mile now that we've had the infomercial. If you think of the typical verticals or markets for a final mile, the top 4 are the ones that most of the people in the room would look at and immediately recognize as being the traditional markets that would utilize some type of technology or utilize something to be able to manage that final mile component. What you'll find, though, is there's actually a significant market for all different types of organizations that are delivering to the final mile that the technology is applicable to them as well. If you look at the final mile and you think about the challenges, so for the people in this room that are not currently delivering in the final mile, what's the primary barrier of why you're not doing that? In the end, in many cases, it comes down to the level of service requirements, because you're talking about where the freight physically interacts with a customer. I'm not going from dock to dock. I'm dealing with someone who is physically interacting with the driver. They put very stringent requirements on the delivery. There's a lot of different things that have to go into making that delivery on time, special requirements, those type of things. And so what you'll see is many of the companies that are not using logistics service provider but are utilizing a private fleet, the number one reason that they cite for that, based on the NPTC benchmarking study, was for service. It's purely to be able to offer that level of service to their customers. And so in order to get into that space and be able to offer that best-in-class or world-class service that's required in order to really excel, the key is the technology that helps get you there. If we look at the challenges that are posed by the final mile and why there's such of a barrier in order to be able to get into that market, because you're dealing with the point where the actual touch point of where the delivery is physically going to the customer, you're dealing with a lot of constraints or a lot of rules around making those deliveries that are not necessarily always there, that are complex in the truckload movement of the product from point A to point B. Obviously, with the fact that I may or may not be delivering to a dock, I could be delivering to someone's house, I could be delivering to a customer that has very limited space behind their store in order to receive that delivery. There's significant challenges associated with that. The other side of it too is that it's multi-stop. So you're not talking about an environment where I'm able to take a truck and basically allocate a truck for a particular shipment. You're talking 10, 15 stops that significantly increase the complexity required in order to make those deliveries. From an environment perspective, the customers are effectively ordering in smaller lot sizes, and the expectation is that they can have a lot of changes all the way up to the last minute. They don't necessarily fit into a business process that says, I'm going to come in and I'm going to have an order cut off at 5 o'clock. I'm going to let you manage your process because you're going to pick in the warehouse, and then coming out the back side of that, then you're going to make deliveries to me tomorrow. They expect to be able to call in at 8 a.m. when the truck's leaving at 8:30 and say, hey, listen, I need to add, another box of tomatoes or whatever it was based on last night's orders from the customers or what we used. So there's a lot of dynamic changes. The expectation for visibility, because of the aforementioned, I've got to meet somebody at the truck, I've got to physically have somebody there that's going to have to help unload or help stock the product. Or if in the omni-channel final mile space, I might be making a delivery to someone's home and they need somebody to be there to actually receive it because this is something that's too large to leave on the front porch. They need to know not only where is everybody, but where are they in relation to where they're supposed to be. So if you think about I've got 200 deliveries that are going out today and they're going out all over the place. The number of people and number of transactions involved when making each one of those is significantly complex, especially when you consider the fact that each of these are so many variables that are playing into this, because if you've got 15 stops on a truck, there's 100 different ways something can go wrong that can screw up the schedule, which then you effectively has the domino effect to the rest of the day. And then finally, after they expect all of these over-the-top service requirements, then they expect you to be able to report and tell them how that you did against what you told them you were going to do. Did you meet service level agreements? There's a lot of things on the reporting side and the back side to be able to manage that. I thought it was kind of worthwhile to talk a little bit about some examples to kind of put it in perspective for how those organizations are the challenges they're faced with and how that enables them to be able to be good users of technology. And if we start with kind of that online retail, Richie mentioned yesterday, routing obviously, being something that's in the omni-channel that was important. But if you look at any type of online retail business, the brick and mortar guys are understanding that the Amazon model is obviously a threat to what they're doing. And they also notice, and the concept behind omni-channel is, I'm going to look at it 2 or 3 places and I'm going to go buy it wherever the cheapest is or wherever has the best service because I want it tomorrow. And the extent to which you're going to see that grow as a medium for deliveries is absolutely going to be at a rocket's pace over the next 3 to 5 years. Those markets have particular challenges because they have a lot of the last minute stuff. There's a lot of coordination that has to happen between inventory because effectively what you're doing is you're using the brick and mortar stores as forward inventory staging locations that I've got to be able to get the product from. You look at the Amazon model, we find situations from a routing perspective where in the Amazon model right now that they're using our software around 150 stops a route. So it's very complex in terms of making all those deliveries. A lot of logistics service providers and delivery agents that, for those of you who aren't familiar with the type of volume they're pushing through, Miami, the Fort Lauderdale, Miami, kind of that little coast area, a single day might run, non-holiday period, might run 15 to 18,000 packages on Amazon. So the delivery agent is actually making 15 to 18,000 stops just in that little market. So just to kind of put that in perspective of how big that is. It's a significant market. If you go look at the direct store delivery, so this is where you traditionally have seen technology implemented. This is where the early adopters kind of came in, and that's where a lot of the systems were originally built for. So there are systems that were originally built for a specific business model, which in many cases was the direct store delivery environment, which is, I kind of expect to see the same place, same face. I know who the customers are going to be. The only question is I've got 200 customers that potentially could order tomorrow, and only 110 of them are going to order, so I just need to figure out which ones are going to go on what routes to kind of manage it. But you have the advantage in that particular environment of being able to kind of start with, I know roughly what I'm going to do and what areas I'm going to have trucks go to, and I can assign 25 stops to a truck, and let's just hope that no more than 10 or 12 of them order, because that's predictable. But they do have some unique challenges in that when you're building that plan in the first place, you've got to have some way to be able to go through and look at what are the delivery patterns and those type of things. And then finally, you look at an example like furniture delivery. So you talk about dynamic. It's a situation where there's a lot of different tools that have to be utilized in part of that, because in the furniture business, you think of, I start with somebody sitting on the floor and they're typing in an order. And when they're typing in, so you're going to go buy a couch and you're sitting there and you're talking with the salesperson. Salesperson's going in, typing in an order, and they're typing in the touch points for the number of people that are entering those addresses is absolutely off the charts. So one person's typing in 100 Main, the next person's 100 North Main, the next one's, they're all over the place. They put street, they don't do it. So to start with, be able to back into that and say, I'm going to have some address validation at the point of sale. And then I'm going to have that address validation at the point of sale carry through to what becomes a logistics problem, which is, here's 200 deliveries tomorrow for all this furniture, which is of all different sizes. I've got a finite amount of trucks or capacity to be able to deliver this on, and each one of these has potentially specific times that you can or cannot be there, and fundamentally they all expect some type of communicated window that is within an hour to 2 hours, because I'm going to literally leave work and go meet the truck. So how do you manage the complexity of all of that inside of one system? There we go. So tools to overcome those challenges. So actually there is tools in the market to be able to do that. We offer them. There's other vendors that offer them as well. But what you will find is that ultimately the tools are there in order to be able to manage, how do I manage both the planning side of the problem, the dispatch side of the problem, and then finally, how do I watch and control? I don't have time with 200 deliveries that are in trucks, and 15 trucks going all over the place. How do I manage the communication of the expectations of service to all those customers without having 25 people sitting and just watching all this and making the calls? So we'll start a little bit in the planning side of things. The question that we get often is, well, I'm at a PC Myler conference, or I'm at an AOK conference. I thought PC Myler does routing. And really to kind of define the difference between what PC Myler does and what a true routing optimization, multi-route optimization system does is, a PC Myler product is the foundation for which a multi-route optimization product lives on. So if I'm doing multi-route optimization, I have to know what the distance and travel time is between two stops. I need to know a lot of the different things that are happening underneath, but that's only one level of constraints. I've got all the other constraints that have to also be applied to that. So really kind of the multi-route optimization is, what stops ought to go on what trucks to kind of minimize the total cost. Now if you think about that, that's a lot of information. So what we're talking about is, just to kind of break this down, if you've got 15 trucks with 15 stops each, that's 1,800 possible combinations that you've got to consider. So if we break it down to the traditional markets, which might be a food service or something that's fairly simple, You can take a lot of shortcuts because you kind of know that these are the customers that traditionally order on a Monday, and I can kind of build some static routes and do those. But when you start talking into the omnichannel, the retail, a lot of the other LTL, a lot of the other markets, that's a lot of information to try to solve, to be able to internalize and then make a decision that is going to be able to effectively be operated to meet all the things, that service level that your customers are expecting. So really, I say it's not just about point A to B, but it's about A to every other possible stop that could go with it. One of the things that you probably don't realize is some of the technology and power that's underneath the ALK, the hood of the ALK system. Is most of you are interfacing with ALK probably by typing a couple of zips. You've got it, or possibly you have it integrated with your ERP system for billing. So you're saying, I want from this zip code to this zip code, and then you're going to take it, and it's going to tell you it's 297 miles, and this is the drive time, and that's kind of what it is. In a routing optimization problem, to put that in perspective, before I can start generating a route, so if I've got 100 stops, first thing I have to do is generate 10,000 distance entries because I don't know what stops are going to go together yet. So it's actually a fairly complex problem that ALK is actually solving before the routing process even begins, that they have to be able to do that. So you think a little bit about how does that actually work. You kind of start with, what are the rules about your customers? So you're doing this manually. If I go into some place, and personally I've been doing it since DOS. It's been really interesting to watch the technology kind of evolve over time. But fundamentally, we're solving in a lot of cases that the fundamental problem is kind of the same business problem. It's, I've got this set of customers, and these customers, they have delivery windows. They have it takes a certain amount of time to make a delivery that could be different on each individual customer. They've got, look at the next one, it says, well, I've got all these orders. Now I've got these orders, and these orders might have a specific appointment time that's different than what the standard delivery times are. I could have different order volumes that could be all over the place. I could have a special equipment or skills needed, so think I've got to have a lift gate because I'm not doing a dockside delivery. I could have a specific skill set that's required if you're possibly going to do some type of service work at the account or the delivery after the delivery's made. I've got all these vehicles and staff, so I've got to think about, I've got all these different truck sizes. Certain size trucks won't go into certain docks. They all have different costs. They all have different work rules. They all have different skills and functions that they can perform, and then whether or not they're even available. So, what good does it do if I build 15 routes and you only got 10 trucks? So being able to manage all of that. And then, kind of finally, and this is the component where ALK really comes in, is this is actually kind of that last layer of constraints, which is we got to kind of understand about the market that we serve. So, street level with commercial restrictions, address matching, correction, we got to know the right place we're going to. And then things like predictive traffic. So if I build a plan that doesn't take into consideration, that, hey, it's going to be 2.5 hours to get to that first stop, not an hour and 15 minutes, then that pretty much exploded. The plan's going to be off all day long. So to be able to look at that information. And then kind of finally, what the rules are about your business. So, I've actually got a good question here that I don't know. You look at things like tolls. I don't know how many people in here are using the tolls module. Is there very many people that utilize that data? We'll show of hands. Not a ton. How many people know what least cost routing is within PC Miler? Do many people even know what that is? So I'm kind of an evangelist for that, and it goes back to being in it for so long and kind of the engineer in me. But so what least cost routing actually does is it says, I'm going from point A to B, and there's actually an example here on the screen, but I'm going from point A to B, and there's actually multiple ways you could get there. So for those of you who ever looked at, if we took 5 people and we were all going to go in the same place, we might all probably have little deviations in the way that we go there. And what least cost routing does is it says, I'll look at what the cost per mile, the cost per hour is, and then I'll tell you what the path is. So if you're utilizing routing and you're saying, okay, I'm just going to always use practical. So you give it 2 points, even in a truckload environment, and you say, I want to use practical. What it's going to do is it's going to look at it, determine what's the best way to go is based on practical, and it gives you the distance, gives you the travel time. In least cost routing, you can actually apply what my cost per mile is, what my cost per hour is, and in the example that's shown here, you've got a scenario where practical is going to say, well, I'm going to take the first option because that's the most practical. it's 185 miles and it's 2 hours and 47 minutes. I could do it for 156 miles, only added 6 minutes. If you'd picked shortest, it would have taken shortest. But you didn't pick shortest. The problem is on each individual request that you're saying, give me the distance between this, what's the mileage going to be? That answer might be different depending on what your preferences are. What do you want to run by? Take tolls into consideration. So how far out of route am I willing to drive if I can avoid a toll? If I take into consideration what my cost per mile and my cost per hour is, as I'm making a determination of what path I'm going to take, I need to factor in what's the total cost to drive this route versus this route versus this route versus this route, including whether I went over the toll or I didn't go over the toll, whether I increased my mileage but I decreased my overall time, or whether I decreased my overall time but increased my mileage. Where's that breaking point? If one of them is 180 miles and the other one's 182, then taking the faster time might make sense. But if it's 158 miles versus 185 and it costs you 3 minutes, you probably like the answer that says I'll be willing to take the 3 minutes. This is all embedded in the functionality that's within the ALK. We utilize it in the routing optimization as well. So that's part of that equation that we're taking into consideration. We're building all these complex models and problems out. So now we built this plan, which is great. Again, we've talked about in the past, it was always kind of a batch process. We go to the next level and say, we built this plan, but really what was the plan was really just to help us as an organization manage what the costs were going to be and be able to manage kind of what some of the service requirements are. But really, what is the primary reason in that final mile why people need, what their expectation is in the final mile? And bottom line, it comes down to service. So if you can't have the ability to not just plan, but now I've got to dispatch it, I've got to have visibility, and then I'm going to have reporting. So we talk about that and say, well, in reality, these can't be discrete processes. I can't build a plan, communicate the plan over to Mobilecom, which is sitting over here on itself. It sucks the plan in, and there's no real communication between any of these systems. I have no ability to report. Maybe I have a plan versus actual, but what you find is because these systems are discrete systems, the plan and actual don't necessarily match up because you had that last minute order, and what happened? You never actually updated the routes to re-push it back to the truck because it wasn't one fluid circle service process. So to be able to have the systems that all work together to be able to manage that effectively is key. So, if you think about the next question that gets asked is, where's my delivery and how much is it costing me to service that account? I mean, how many people in here, many of you actually do final mile, or is kind of what's the, I know that I saw a few of you yesterday that do that, but what's the cost to serve account? So you've got a particular customer what is the physical cost to service that account? So, and then look at that in a report that says, what's my cost to serve versus how much gross margin I'm making on that account? There's certain accounts you'll find that actually, because of their time windows or some type of service level requirements, you're actually losing money on. Now, I get there's some accounts that you would potentially want to do that for, just because you don't want your competitors to potentially come into that little market, and it just kind of keeps your presence in that particular area. But ultimately, the question is do you have the information available to make those decisions, or are you just kind of taking all business whether it's profitable or not? And then, of course, I need to have that visibility. And what do we all want? We want our mobile phones. We want our tablets. We want to be able to have that information, visibility, everybody in the organization. Not that the dispatchers have this information, so I'm going to go through a process where I say, I've communicated a route, I built a route, I sent it over to Mobilecom. Now everybody's in Mobilecom. They're going and looking and see where the dots are on the map, try to figure out where the truck is. So if I want to know something, the first thing I've got to do, I'm talking to the customer, I got to call dispatch. Dispatch is going to go look at a system. He looks at it. If he can think he knows where he is, he'll tell me. If not, he's going to have to message the driver. And there's this whole loop. I want everybody within the organization to have access to that level of visibility, regardless of what type of device that they have available to them. And then I want it to monitor by exception. Who's got time to sit and watch all these trucks drive around all day? So let's let the system say, well, I know what the plan was because I built it. And also my plan actually matched what I'm actually executing because I had the ability all in one system to be able to make sure that my plan was completely synced with what I was executing. So I want to be able to monitor by exception. I want to be able to streamline communication, so outbound communications. Rather than waiting for the customer to contact me, what if I shot a text message or an email not to the customer or maybe to the customer service agent that said, you need to call XYZ customer because based on where we're at right now, we're going to miss the time window. So not just that I'm 30 minutes late or 60 minutes late, that could be a different a barrier for different customers. So I may have 10 stops on a route. The only one I'm going to miss the time window on is on the 5th stop. So that's the one I actually need to communicate to. The rest of them probably don't. As long as I'm within their window, I'm going to make that. Or I want to have the ability to provide my customers with direct visibility. So whether you're utilizing a customer-facing web page that is provided by your solution provider that allows you to have a branded web page where they can go in and type their order number, they can type their account ID and see exactly where that's at, or whether you take that information and you consume it via either a web service so that you can basically make those calls in real time and display that inside your own portal if you want to have the ability to do that. So be able to offer those type of tools to you and offer those directly to your customer so they can go look at that information themselves. Of course, that information is all great if it does, assuming that it's right, which that's always the question we get asked, which is, as soon as I let my customers have access to all this information, I've let them under the covers, well, what do I do when the information is not right? So it's using things like, AOK maps with traffic and weather in it, so to be able to see what's happening that can potentially affect my deliveries today. You look at historical traffic for when I'm planning, because remember, I'm planning last night or maybe early this morning. Real-time traffic does me absolutely no good when I'm planning, because real-time means that. It's real-time. So if I'm planning at 8 a.m. in the morning, well, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Real-time is not going to do me any good, because the time he's going to pass on that road is going to be 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But I want to have the ability to have real-time traffic when I'm actually in the execution phase, including down to active traffic, so that we can actually have the system programmed to be able to utilize route around type events. And then finally, communicate the plan from the back office down to the device. Now, how many people in this room are using some sort of navigation? It doesn't have to be okay, but just some sort of navigation for their drivers on the trucks that you're supplying versus how many that your drivers are using on their own. So they're kind of basically using it on their own, making their own decisions. So this is another thing that I'm kind of passionate about, because ultimately, if you think of the disconnect, you've got a system, and we did all this intelligent planning on the front end of the process, and then we get down to the end, and we let the guy basically use a navigation application, regardless of who it comes from, whether it be from AOK or some other vendor, using something that's on your Verizon phone. In the end, the plan that you built in the back office was not necessarily communicated down to the truck for him to follow. So I talked earlier about least cost routing. I talked about avoid tolls. I talked about all these things, which you've made all these great decisions on the back end, and then you send it to the driver, and then he decided to go across the GW anyway because that's the way he wanted to go, or that's the way the navigation system routed him. So the extent of the back office flows all the way through the cab is extremely important. If you think about on the navigation side of things, how many are using a navigation app that doesn't necessarily have commercial vehicle restrictions because the driver's using his phone because you didn't supply him with something? So, there's a lot of things that are going on there, and the extent to which you've got that full circle of service that I built it in the back office. I potentially made any changes when I dispatch. I communicated down to the truck, and then I also have the ability, which is very interesting. So in the Copilot application, you actually have the ability to have different settings. So there's 3 levels that you can actually deploy to say how hard I want to enforce route compliance. So one is we'll push it down and we'll basically tell it this is how I want to go. And the driver can drive it, but if he gets off route or starts going out of sequence, again, for those of you who are over the road, it's not as important. But if he goes off sequence, that was kind of a suggestion for him. And then we can monitor his route compliance against that. Second level says, I want to try to get him back on the path. In other words, if he turns off, I'll try to get him back on, but I'm going to try to find a logical way to kind of get him back on the way that I wanted him to go. Third way is hardcore. It says, hey, if I have to backtrack you 20 miles to get you back on path, I'm going to give you a navigation path that says this is the way I want you. Because I could potentially have your fuel stops built into that in a more over-the-road environment. Or in the final mile case, you really want them to follow the route sequence as opposed to kind of doing their own thing. But the end result here is that the ability to manage from back office into the cab and then report back. I show reports, so we take customer reports and we sanitize driver performance. And the first thing that stands out, usually when you look at that, is I get questions around, well, I expected to see drivers that were running more miles. I don't necessarily, why are they running less? So how's the driver running less? Well, the driver possibly ran less. So actual versus plan, he was supposed to run 157 miles. He did it in 146. And they go, well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because we built a plan in the back office that took into consideration both the distance and then also that least cost path that said, based on time and all other things, we'd rather you do this. And the driver decided to cut the corner. Now, that might be one of the reasons that he had a bunch of stops that were delayed, because he decided to take a path that was actually longer than what we thought we should take when we planned the back office, because we had information available when we planned that, including historical traffic and those type of things. So just to kind of, in closing a little bit, it says, well, where do we go from here? So I've got all these tools, and I look at organizations that have never really gotten into the final mile, and fundamentally they just didn't kind of get there because they were intimidated by all of these things that we talked about that are requirements in order to truly be successful in the final mile. And ultimately what I'd tell you is the technologies, to solve these type of challenges, they're already available. This is something that's, commercially off the shelf. There's significant growth in the final mile market. I think you're going to see between omni-channel, if you think about it, one of two things are going to happen in the omni-channel. They're going to have it where you're going to go in the store and pick it up, or they're going to start doing more deliveries. So you're talking about events where people today are used to going to a retail store and physically do their shopping and taking those goods home with them. Now that is actually a delivery event that somebody is going to capitalize on and make money on. So that's something that if I was to leave you with something, that is absolutely a market opportunity for those of you who want to potentially dip your toe in that space. If you're already in the final mile, there are savings through technology. If you're using maps that are 5 years old, I don't understand that. I see it all the time. But there are savings through technology, and you can actually increase the customer service and generate a return on investment out of it, simply because, I promise you, if you handed me 200 tickets and give me 30 minutes to solve it, I'm not going to beat what the system has the capability to do. It's physically impossible to do. And then finally, if you're in the final mile, are you going to excel? I mean, you got to have the ability to differentiate yourself from competitors, and then create a more simplified process that's not a distinct individual set of processes that happen in a vacuum, none of them really talking to each other than a flat file getting thrown over the wall. So how do you be able to build that total circle of service for an integrated process to fundamentally put you in a position to excel above those that would compete against you in that space? So I've got about 10 minutes if anybody has any questions.
I was from Sunrise Transport in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. My question is, in the routing process, how are you routing off of a map by connecting dots of locations, or are you doing it in another way? Like how are you configuring your route?
Yeah, so ultimately goes back to that question of what's the difference between PC Miler and really what multi-route optimization does. So what PC Miler is going to do is it will definitely connect the dots. If you say, I want these 4 stops, I know I want them to be on a route, and I want PC Miler to tell me the sequence to run them in, PC Miler will absolutely do that. What we do on top of that is we say, well, that's one component of it, but ultimately what we need to understand is, should those be the 4 stops that you put on that route? So if you looked at time windows and the capacities of the trucks and the size of the stops and all the constraints that were associated with that, it's not a 4 stops, give me the best sequence. It's 100 stops, and here's 10 trucks. What's the best way to optimize all of this given all of those constraints? It's John Eric. We're in trouble now.
James, how dynamic is the system? Like once the driver starts commencing on those trips, if he has a delay or something like that, does it push all the other ones out and then give you a suggestion of what you should take off?
So by default, it's going to push all the other ones out. The only ones that it would potentially take off would be in a pickup environment where you could potentially be rescheduling pickups. Obviously, in a typical delivery environment, you kind of have to deliver whatever you left on the truck with. But the system automatically says, I know where you're at. I know where you are in relation to where you're supposed to be. So think of a traditional environment where you've got a plan. You've communicated that plan over to MobileCom. And now that's what the driver's seeing in his dispatch screen inside of his truck. And then he starts executing that plan. But really, where's that feedback loop at? So when we get the feedback and we understand where they are in the route, we can actually reforecast what all the ETAs are for all the other stops on that route dynamically. And as we're reforecasting that, we can then automatically manage all the alerts. So rather than having to go and request that information, the system can automatically push it to you, or having the ability, if I want to go look that up, I can go look that up on a screen where I can search on an order, I can search on a customer, and the end result being that anybody in the organization has access to the same information. So if I go search on a particular customer that happens to be the 7th stop on a truck and the driver just left, I still have the ability to have some visibility to say, okay, we planned on being there at 12, but it looks like the truck left 30 minutes late. So right based on where he's at right now, we're looking at about 12:30.
I guess second to that, if there's certain constraints on that are timed because a place is going to close or something of that nature, will it reprioritize that stop sequence?
You can have the systems go in and reprioritize stop sequence as well. Again, it comes down to what type of products you're delivering. In many cases, if you loaded it on the truck a certain way, you might have to, maintain sequence. Got somebody at the back.
Yes, John Moscatelli at AT&T. That 15 stops, 15 trucks, 1,800 combinations, I found that to be astounding and eye-opening. So my question really is, do you have customers of that size? And at what point is it cost efficient for customers to entertain TMW as a possible solution, for example? Yeah,
so it ranges. Usually you'll see accounts that will have particular, 4 or 5 trucks. If you've got 2, you send one north, one south. It doesn't take a lot of optimization to do that. There's advantages in the visibility aspects of it, but it's not as complicated. Obviously, the more complicated it gets, the more opportunity there is to leverage the technology. You'll see typically a sweet spot is, somebody with 20 or larger. You will find opportunity. We've got quite a few, probably at least 150 fleets that are under 20 trucks. But ultimately, the key is it really gets down into what their business model is and whether or not their processes, they've done something a certain way for a long time. And what you'll find is there's various levels of adoption. Don't have to assume that everybody's going to do full-blown optimization. If you're in food service, odds are you're not going to do full-blown optimization. You've got too many customers that are too used to seeing the same driver. He's there at roughly the same time every day. And as soon as you show up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you normally get there at 9, you're going to get blown up with calls. There's no reason they could be there from 8 to 5. That's what the time window says, but they can't take that variability. They're used to getting that type of level of service. And you get in other environments, they're not as not as prone to having those type of restrictions on them.
What about the decision-making of running your own type of fleet plus a for-hire carrier network? Is there visibility to have the system run cost of both thing and say, yeah, put this on your private fleet, or no, but we don't want to put this on a for-hire carrier?
Yeah, so actually, excellent question. So one of the things that we've been able to adopt is the ability to connect. It requires that you have one of the TMS systems as opposed to using it in kind of that standalone. I showed the slide earlier around, a private fleet adoption versus more using one of the for-hire, TMS type systems. Because ultimately, what we're doing is we're tapping into the rating engine, and so we're basically making a mode decision between LTL, truckload, multi-stop, or full truckload versus private fleet, including things like not just, as an example, a discrete event might be if I'm in Dallas, I might have a load with 4 stops going to Houston that if I just looked at that load in and of itself, it might make sense to take that load, do the 4 stops, and just give it to a carrier because my cost to run that lane is cheaper because obviously we're hitting the rating engines, we're making all those optimization decisions. The system might decide whether if there was a backhaul there or there's third-party freight, it might actually, because it's putting a tour together, it might actually decide, hey, well, I'll convert this over to dedicated or private because during the optimization I see that I'm actually able to do the combination of all this cheaper than what I can if I run these as 2 independent, discrete, third-party loads.
Does it have the ability to tap into the freight broker load boards that are out there?
It's not tapping into the freight broker load boards as much. It's looking at all the loads that, from a shipper perspective, you're typically looking at the loads that you have available, or a distributor perspective. Here's the loads that I have available, and what it's going to do is is look at any loads that you would have, any orders that you have available that need to be delivered, as well as anything to be picked up, and it can do that in an environment, in a multi-location environment. So in other words, where I've got maybe a DC in Houston, a DC in Dallas, I've got this, and I'll kind of look at it as a holistic approach instead of each individual one of these locations being discretely planned and not paying any attention that, hey, I finaled pretty close to Houston, I could swing over there, get my next load, and then I can run this all on private, and it's X dollars cheaper than if I ran this, separate. But it's planning on what freight visibility that it has inside the TMS system. And then, of course, all the rates that you've got defined. So look at your rate tables and determine what's your, it's going to hit ZAR Lite for LTL, or I believe it hits FedEx tables as well. And then it'll also, of course, look at all your truckload rates. And then you define what your private fleet costs are. It's one of the actually interesting characteristics I think that we offer competitive advantage in, is that because we started from an optimization perspective, we have that final mile solution that's a traditional, private fleet, DSD, I'm going to go out, I'm a food service distributor, and be able to manage that final mile, is that the decisions that are taken into consideration in the optimization actually go down to that granular of a level. They're not necessarily have to be made at kind of, I'm tricking the system to think that my fleet is a common carrier by putting some cost in to make it think that, okay, this particular carrier is really my private fleet, and it's just got a different set of costs, and I'm letting the system, I can tell the system I got 10 trucks, and then it optimizes all that. Any other questions? Yeah, so the majority of what we talked about is the Appian product. The only thing that's a little bit different is the questions he was asking around mode selection is transportation modeler. And so it's built on the Appian base that you own, but it's got the rating, it basically connects to the rating engines, and then it solves that mode selection problem, as opposed to just purely, hub and spoke, private fleet. Outstanding. I absolutely appreciate the time today. Within 2 minutes, it's probably a personal best. Appreciate the time, and if you got any questions, feel free to talk to me, or there's Monica Trollsch, who's also with TMW. We got the man himself, John Parker, at the back, that you're welcome to ask any questions to. Thank you.